The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Kia ora tātou, my name is Toby Manhire, and this is a special edition of Gone by Lunchtime. It was recorded towards the end of May, on May the 27th, in those last days of Level 2, which many of you will remember. It was in Wellington at Meow, and it was our Politics and Pubs special, which is a collaboration between Spin-off members and Verb Wellington, which is a very cool organisation that runs literary events and other events. And yeah, it was a great night in Meow. Everyone was safely distanced, and it was Danyl Mclauchlan talking to Chlöe Swarbrick, the Green MP, and it's a fascinating conversation. We hope you enjoy it.
Thanks for setting that up, guys.
That's why Toby's here.
Yeah, that's why Toby Manhire is here somewhere, lurking in the back of the room. I've got a little note of people to thank here. I always feel like kind of I'm reading a hostage note when I read these things out. So thank you very much to Meow for hosting us. It's great to be out again. You can drink as much as you like because it's good for the economy. So you kind of have this built-in sort of permission to
harm reduction.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Okay, drink a lot responsibly. And so, yeah, thank you very much for that, guys. Thanks to Misfit Brewery for supplying beer for the speakers, of which there is one. So, well done, Chloe. I don't know. Apparently, it's in the mail.
I thought I bought my beer.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, that's right. And in the event of an earthquake, which now does not seem that unlikely, please calmly exit and assemble in the courtyard outside, and follow the lead and instructions of the Meow staff who are trained, allegedly. Okay. Hi, everyone. So we're here to talk about... Hello, Chloe. We're here to talk about change and political change.
With our friends.
So I just thought I'd ask you kind of like to just sort of like chat a bit before we get into the really heavy stuff. Have you noticed ways in which the world has changed? like just sort of like no. I mean like real kind of like social change. Just like now that we're getting back out of it, have people changed in any meaningful way?
I think everyone's just stoked to see other people.
To be back.
Yeah, I remember walking. Also, kia ora.
Yeah.
I am renowned for being shocking at introducing myself. So hello. Thank you for all being here. Hi, Danyl. So I remember walking back into the parliamentary office under level 3. I think we came back. Yes. And I'm just going to, and I remember seeing people in person and being like, oh my God, you're in 3D. You're no longer in Zoom. Yeah. So that was really awesome. And I think a lot of people were excited about that. I think that there is a lot more awareness of being in close physical proximity to people, if we're talking about real tangible ways that people's lives have changed. And that's been interesting in terms of some people quite actively and explicitly flouting the rules, but then others, obviously being extremely cautious. It's been interesting to see the people who embrace the hugs and the high fives and the handshakes as opposed to the elbow bumps. And yeah, beyond that, I think that there was this real palatable embrace, at least on my social media bubble, of the potential for change in politics. And those conversations haven't necessarily gone away. For anybody who is, on Twitter, all 1,000 of us in New Zealand. Anyway, I think that there are a lot of people who are really frustrated by a sense that potential hasn't necessarily been grasped.
I got a haircut today, which
Proud of you.
Looks incredible, obviously.
Yeah.
But it was like my post-lockdown haircut, and my hairdresser trimmed my eyebrows, which is something that has never happened to me before.
And the lockdown was an excuse, Danyl.
And he didn't even ask my consent; it just happened. And I kind of I don't know.
Is it your usual hairdresser?
No, it's my usual barber.
Okay.
So, I don't know, it seemed like kind of a symbol of something, like that the world has changed in
your relationship with your hairdresser.
Yeah. That the world has changed in quite dark and unpredictable ways. And I wondered if that was the kind of change that the Green Party approved of. I don't know.
No, Danyl, we believe in consent.
Okay. So... To kind of get into slightly more meaningful forms of change, although we can speak to that more if you want to. So, we've argued about politics in the past, but we haven't done it in front of an audience before. And one of the things you've kind of asked me before is, what is my theory?
Oh my God, he's about to, Wow, how much are you about to espouse?
What is my theory of change is this question that you've asked me, and I haven't answered you because I don't have one. And so I kind of wanted to say, what is the Chlöe Swarbrick theory of change? How do we make change, and how does it all work? How does political meaningful change happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think when you genuinely investigate the concept of a theory of change, it doesn't necessarily have to go in any certain direction, whether that be left or right or progressive or conservative or what have you. Obviously, I have a preference in it going progressively, but I think it's useful to look at it in a kind of model. So the way that I look at the sphere of potential for change is broadly in two categories. And on the one side of things, there's kind of the structural stuff, which is legislation, regulation, funding, taxation, incentives, subsidies, social welfare, contract, and treaties, so kind of international arrangements. And that's all the stuff that I think people kind of regularly refer to when they refer to the system. But the part of the conversation that is often left unsaid is the conversation about culture. Now, culture by definition, I learnt this through my ex-boyfriend's degree, but culture by definition is about a shared set of values.
What was his degree in?
It was in design thinking. At AUT, who today I was having a bit of a pop at. It wasn't necessarily about AUT, it was about the structural change that needed to be brought about, and they were the tip of the iceberg. So that's the point about using the example and trying to galvanise people around an issue to bring about an environment that's conducive to structural change. So culture, by definition, shared set of values. Really important to recognise that, because we often think about culture as synonymous with ethnicity or religion or someone's geographical background. Those things aren't immediately culture. They can be proxies for or shortcuts to understand culture, but they're not the same thing, which is how you can end up with a shared set of values amongst very diverse groups of people. So different touch points for culture are stuff like media, that includes social media, stuff like collective action and community building, and things like education. And education is obviously a really important one, but it's also not the one that you would necessarily immediately go to if you want to bring about immediate change in society, because it takes time to shift values through that kind of method. So I think when you investigate all of those different methodologies for change, you can kind of trace through all of the different ways that we have facilitated. I mean, to use a classic example, right? Actually a really daft example. Think about the example of people speeding. So you've got a 50k speed limit sign in a neighbourhood, and everybody goes 60k's. So you can have a structural response to that, and you can go, hey, we're going to increase penalties. You can have a structural response to that goes, hey, everybody is just by culture going at 60 Ks, so maybe we just change the speed limit to 60 Ks and then we've resolved it. So you kind of give up and go, we're changing the structure because culture isn't necessarily fit to it. But if you don't investigate the culture as part of that equation, then you can end up with a perverse outcome whereby when you change the speed limit to 60 Ks, all of a sudden everybody starts going 70 Ks. Because actually the culture was everybody went 10 Ks above the speed limit. So that's a very dumb example, but that's kind of about the really important connections between the cultural norms that we have and the way that we use them unconsciously to interact with each other and to interact with laws, regulations, and otherwise.
Something I kind of wonder about is, do we have like a shared set of values, or do we have like a sort of economic system which has its own logic, which is completely indifferent to our values?
I think that all law, because it is created by human beings, is inherently value-laden, and we come to interpret that in... sorry, everybody, this is now a philosophical lecture brought to you by Danyl and Chloe.
It's just going to get worse. So,
yeah, it probably
like
is.
I say, drinking is, encouraged and probably necessary.
To make sense of it. But I think that... I think we do have shared values. And I mean, that's actually reflected in research. All political parties undertake this kind of research and they try and figure out how to, in a nice kind of way to say it, how to appeal to it, and a worse way to say it, how to exploit it. And that is a way to open people's minds or to shape their perspective around an issue, which ends up facilitating the mandate for that structural change. And that's the thing about cultural change, creating an environment that's conducive to structural change.
Because I guess what I was thinking about is the welfare changes that brought in this week, the sort of second-tier welfare system, which, when you kind of talk to people in Labour, like there is a logic to that it's about like preventing mortgage defaults and preventing financial instability and a
but
worse
screw
depression.
everybody who
Well,
is
yeah.
screwed.
And so they can like very, very persuasively and convincing say, well, like there is this sort of like economic logic to what we're doing.
I mean, you can logically argue anything if you want to. Obviously, not to the standard of you can rationalise everything. You can't necessarily make everything fit within the bounds of logic. So that's the thing about if you want to extrapolate that into any given issue, particularly social issues. And I would argue, and actually, I'm currently because of all the flack that you get for being a Green. Involved in politics and talking about things like economics. I'm now doing postgrad studying public policy, particularly with a focus in economics. And Garol, the former head of Treasury, is one of my lecturers. And I hit him up about it because I'm really fascinated by how we hold out these certain kind of academic trends as being like the be-all, end-all, the God, the Jesus, the deity at which we all must pray. That is responsible for everything as we know it, and was kind of investigating the notion that economics is the be-all, end-all. There's this thing that fell from the sky that just is what it is. And, we're having this conversation back and forth, and he basically just said, yeah, it's a social science. And that's the thing, right? It is all ultimately conducive as to whether, it is all ultimately rather coming down to how people engage with the rules as they are set.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a few thoughts, I don't know.
Yeah. So the two things that I often think when people start talking about like systemic transformational change, and these are kind of contradictory, but that's okay, is one, like, do we really need systemic change? And like...
Well, you and I probably don't.
No.
We're doing okay, as is everybody else probably
but I
in this room.
I guess like our society... it kind of feels like New Zealand, especially in this moment of time, kind of is doing something right. And you can get too self-congratulatory and say about that and kind of say, well, like nothing needs to change, but obviously there are. But like, I sort of like feel nervous when people say, well, we just need like really radical change to change everything, kind of burn it all down and start again. When like obviously there are admirable qualities about our society, and yeah, like isn't that sort of an argument for like incremental change, the kind of classic centrist argument that we sort of like need to be moderate and incremental and take things slowly.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that is often pitched as incrementalist, and I guess largely it is. But I mean, there is also the rationale to it as put out by the likes of David Hall from AUT. AUT is not a sponsor of tonight, but it's true. Look at my Twitter, and he kind of talks about the need for a careful revolution. That being that whenever you actually consider revolutions in society historically and the upheaval that they have caused, and particularly the devastation that they have caused, it's very painful. Yep. So his argument is that you actually need to investigate what a just transition is, and you need to ensure that people are protected through that, and there is a buffer in place. But I do think that oftentimes we end up like particularly in parliamentary politics, what pisses me off, Danyl.
Okay.
So it's that there is, just to give you a very broad brushstroke binary, in my wisdom of 3 years in Parliament, that's a joke, is that there is kind of two broad focuses, I think, which parliamentarians end up centralising on. There's kind of obviously a spectrum they can end up, the world isn't binary. And on the one side, it's kind of this, for lack of a better term, careerism. And then on the other side, it is genuine kind of belief in the kaupapa, the principles, the value set, the policies, or whatever it is, the ideology, however you want to frame it. I find it really funny when politicians, and I've had a go about this in Parliament before, say that they aren't ideological, or that the government's just being ideological. And I'm just like, mate, do you know what ideology is? Yeah. Do you know how? Yeah. Anyway,
there's this famous Keynes quote. I'm going to mangle it, but the people who don't think they're ideological are slaves to sort of like defunct economists and philosophers.
Well,
which I always think
totally.
But if you don't think you're ideological, it just means you are, and probably quite like flawed. And
it's and that's the thing about being consistently critical of your belief system and not dogmatic. I mean, if you are consistently kind of attempting to unpick it, like another perhaps far more colloquial version of that is that tradition is essentially just peer pressure from dead people. But anyway. There is the one side of things which is kind of the careerism, which can be a focus. And obviously there's different weightings that can be given to these two things, and it is broad brushstroke, it needs to be investigated. But on the other side, it's the kind of change that you're in the place to try and bring about. And I think particularly, and this is just my personal opinion, this doesn't bear any weight in the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand, etc., nor does it represent the government, but I look particularly at the larger parties and the way that they put parliamentarians and MPs through their hoops, through the ranks. Yep. And it's basically that in order to have an opinion, you have to sit down, shut up, be a vote.
Breathe through your nose is the word they tend to use.
Yeah, but for 10 years, you don't, you're not really saying anything controversial publicly. And if you are, you're very publicly reprimanded. And what that means, I think, is that you can end up in this perverse situation where you can justify incrementalism because you argue that you need to be there in that position in order to facilitate the change. And I don't think people actually think about how selfish that is. Or can be.
Yeah, I guess that was the other thing that I always feel suspicious about when I hear people talking about radical change, because I feel like it's become a marketing tool in left-wing and progressive politics. That it's something that...
She says wearing a Bernie Sanders t-shirt.
Is it Bernie? Okay, yeah. It's a way to kind of, like a way to sell t-shirts, or a way to Well,
that's the thing. As soon as your radical slogans are in Glassons, like how radical are you,
Yeah. Okay, so... Is the window... So we're like talking about this...
Do we want to talk about the Pride Parade? I mean, no. Anyway,
you'll get us both cancelled. No. So, like, we're kind of talking about change in this moment because it seems, and maybe I should be using the past yet, seemed like there was this kind of window of change that, the coronavirus
the
crisis...
The Overton window, Danyl?
Well, yeah, maybe. We can talk about that if you want. But yeah, it seemed like people were kind of saying, hey, we're in this crisis, and like maybe sort of like, the window is wider than it has been in the past, and maybe things can happen.
I think people were just really interested in talking about ideas that they perhaps weren't necessarily open to before.
Right.
I don't know if that means, and I was just talking to Max Rashbrook, economist. You're an economist? Yeah, okay, he's an economist, about the idea of, and this is Max's hypothesis, not necessarily mine, I've got a mull on it before I steal it. No, but the notion that disaster kind of socialism, is that what you said, is as potentially undemocratic and problematic as disaster capitalism. And just that rushing things through in a really undemocratic, very urgent way without having the conversation with people or building the mandate for that change is really problematic. But, that kind of brings me back to the commentary that I saw around your piece in the spin-off, shout out Toby, about Piketty's book, Capital and Ideology, which is a 1,000-page tome.
That's monstrous.
Yeah, I took it to Tongariro this weekend, and my partner was really angry at me for taking up that much space in the suitcase, but because I read about 20 pages of it. And the notion that, I don't know how to say the word, the Bahrain left? Brahmin.
Yeah.
The Brahmin left, and you'd explain it. You're the guy who wrote it.
Okay, so you're going to make this whole room of people angry with me. So the Brahmin left...
I want to gauge the response to it, because I think it's really important.
So the Brahmin left is this idea in Piketty's new book, and what he's done is he's gone and looked at voting patterns in like the US and the UK and France.
Yeah, France. He's from France.
Yeah, and it holds true in New Zealand, which shows that kind of in the mid-20th century, left-wing political parties were mainly supported by kind of like, the lower classes, the proletariat. And that was sort of really grouped by education. So people that left school early, they didn't have degrees, kind of supported left-wing political parties. And that's changed quite radically in the 21st century. So now left-wing political parties, the top 10% of people overwhelmingly support left-wing political parties, and right-wing political parties are kind of increasingly supported by the proletariat or whatever you want to call them. And so he has this term, the Brahmin left, which kind of says most of the people that control political parties and influence the cultural sector and the education sector are this sort of new, essentially aristocratic faction. But they're a faction that kind of don't see themselves as part of the ruling class. They very much like to see themselves as kind of transgressive and sort of left-wing and believing in changing things, but sort of believe in a kind of change that never really changes anything because they're so empowered by the status quo. They're kind of rich and they have really nice jobs. And so the Brahmin left prefer symbolic cultural victories. So I thought a really great example was there was a huge fight this week over Todd Muller owning a MAGA hat. And the same day that was a huge debate kind of on the sort of intellectual left, the Labour Party was introducing this two-tier benefit system, and I thought, wow, that's just such a perfect symbolism of Piketty's thesis. You have kind of the sort of cultural elite obsessing over this, symbolic war, and something that's really quite an anathema to sort of left-wing political values being introduced by a left-wing political party.
And I think, I think that it is really important that we take on board and don't cancel people like Danyl, because that is a really valuable critique.
You're about 5 or 10
I saw
years
the
late
responses from people who I know on Facebook. But
lots of academics and Guardian columnists got really angry with me for writing that review. So.
I will leave commentary on that between the lines. So the thing that I find really fascinating about the response to your kind of critique is that it was seen as being synonymous with a critique of the need to fight for recognition of how there is different types of oppression, or the need for equity, which recognises differences or diversity or what have you. And the funny thing actually about the hat is I think it is really symbols are really important. But the point was best made, I think, by my colleague Gauri's Gadaman, that it's why are we all just talking about the hat as a matter of symbol? when actually we have the opportunity to be investigating the voting record of a guy who's holding himself out to want to be the leader of the country, which actually is pretty much in line with the person who is responsible for that symbol with regard to women's rights, gay rights, etc. Although he's relaxed. It's John Key 2.0. And I love people being relaxed about my right to marry. So I just... Yeah, I think it is really important that we do not take a dogmatic approach where we consistently think that we're always right, and anybody who is attempting to critique is inherently an enemy, because that is stifling to evolution. And as you say, it is part of what has helped to alienate particularly the people that the left purport to represent, which are working class.
I'm really glad you said that, because it lets me segue just really effortlessly into this next question. So there have been lots of kind of like in the COVID moment, there have been lots of people sort of saying, giving what I call kind of now more than ever speeches, which is when you sort of say, wow, this is really amazing moment and the world is changing. And now
Would you have ever written one of those
now
speeches?
Now more than ever, everything that I've always said is like really, really true.
Yeah.
And so there have been lots of these coming from different directions. So what I'm curious about is there anything you've changed your mind about, like in response to everything that's happening? Like, yeah.
I don't necessarily think that. Nothing floats to mind immediately. I do, as I say, I remember coming back to Parliament very vividly, because it was only like 3 weeks ago, and just I was actually talking to Max about this just before at the bar. I was just like, really, this is it. I would love the... I hate a lot of the performative politics that we end up undertaking, but I also recognise the importance of that in terms of facilitating the cultural conversation that means that we get the mandate for that structural change. But the way that parliamentarians have created the culture of our adversarial parliament, I just find really exhausting and a massive waste of time a lot of the time. There is so much more work. You know how everybody always complains on comments on the social media comments whenever there's a speech posted and everyone's like, but where are all the parliamentarians? Why are we paying you? Well, we all have to be on precinct until 10 o'clock at night. I currently have leave because I'm musterer. And the work that gets done in our offices is far more valuable. And that's actually something which I was reflecting within a conversation with you before I wrote my maiden speech.
Yes.
And that was, yes, with you, and Pointing's Road. And my kind of thesis on it was that everything that happens in the chamber is performative. Like the politics is the stuff, the world-changing things happen behind the scenes. Everybody knows what's going to happen before they go into Parliament. The chamber is orchestrated.
There's this show, this famous British political show, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. I don't know if millennials know it. But
I'm aware of it.
Right. There's a lot of wisdom in that show, but the writer, this guy Lynn, his name was asked, why do you never show anything that's happening in Parliament? Why is the House never in the show? And he said, because my show is about power and the House is about theatre. And I want to show how the country is governed, not how the sort of like the theatre of how it pretends to be governed. Yeah,
totally.
So, yeah.
Totally. And I mean, that is what I find really, just to kind of walk through for people, how I think that you can trace some of the most effective kind of changes that we've managed to get through in the past 3 years that I have played some part in or participated in. In the drug law reform kind of area around the Misuse of Drugs Act, that came about as a result of the synthetics crisis. And at the start of the year, it was really, really percolating in the media space. And there was this kind of knee-jerk response and reaction, particularly from the National Party, that we just needed to penalise people more. We needed to ratchet up penalties under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And at that point in time, I actually knew next to nothing about drug policy before I came into Parliament. I'd been doing all of this reading and I was like, that is absolutely incorrect. Simply penalising people doesn't deal with the problem, but also the problem is always to do with demand. Because as long as people have shitty lives, people will abuse substances because they need a form of escapism. not just substances, whether it's gambling or pornography or, whatever your thing is. And I was having these kind of conversations behind the scenes, as much as I can tell you, I will tell you, with the minister, the health minister, and Andrew Little, the justice minister, and Stuart Nash, the police minister, which is like the holy trifecta of the drug ministers. And they don't take that in the wrong way. They are responsible.
That's a really good
for
band name. If this whole politics thing doesn't work out for you,
yeah,
that could be,
I always wanted to be a
holy
stand-up
trifecta
comic,
of
but
the drug
I'm
ministers.
shocking.
Yeah.
Yes, they are responsible for legislation pertaining to drugs. So I was kind of talking to all of them and their officials and whatnot, and I had this conversation with folks who will remain unnamed, and I was like, there was this response of how we had to just, we had to do what everybody was asking for. We had to increase penalties. We had to prohibit them more. And I was like, but that's not going to work. You have demonstrable proof. Here's all of the screeds and screeds of stuff. And they were like, yeah, but we just have to do something. I was like, what?
Yeah.
We just have to do something?
See, this is another Yes Minister quote.
Yeah, but we just have to do something.
We have to do something. This is something. We must do this.
Yes, totally.
That goes, yeah.
And I was just like, I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen here. And I was really fortunate, and this is kind of, lifting the lid on stuff. I was really fortunate in that at that point in time, the National Party were trying to push through, because they got Simeon Brown's bill pulled out of the biscuit tin, and he was doing exactly the same thing, trying to ratchet up penalties. And because we were relatively new as a government, the government didn't want to give credit to him for doing that.
Okay.
So that was a massive opportunity for me to be like, he's wrong, but that's actually a proxy for what some people are trying to do, and to progress the argument in a very public way. And we ended up through that, it's kind of the way that things happen when you end up being, a backbench first-term MP. But, the ministers, Nash and Clark, ended up fronting on that and putting it forward as it was this massive kind of taking it to the drug dealers bill. But actually the changes to Section 7 of the Misuse of Drugs Act that we managed to negotiate through there effectively decriminalise all low-level use of substances and require that the police, by default, actually instead send people to health services. It's massive, but it happened relatively undercover. And that's the bullshit of politics, folks.
So now more than ever, you think that politics is still put too performative?
I think, I just this adversarial, colonial, the Westminster Parliament, if you were to design a system that was capable of responding to the massive challenges that we as humanity face, you would not design Parliament. You would instead focus on bringing experts into the room, focus on bringing representation into the room, but instead we have this space that is, as you kind of have articulated already, very much kind of focused on the theatre, the guise, the facade of we've all got it under control. But, anybody who has had any proximity to Parliament knows that parliamentarians are just people trying their best. There is absolutely no magical powers, and I'm actually really grateful for the fact that we have no threshold of elitism inside our representative democracy, because it enables it the potential to be genuinely representative. And I think that's how weirdos like me end up slipping through the cracks and ending up in there. And that shows anily can.
We have a much higher weirdo quotient under MMP, don't we? Although it seems to be, I'm not
talking about the Greens.
ACT were pretty weird.
Okay. Hey, Brooke.
ACT, when they had a lot of MPs, was, I think, the strangest party we've ever had.
You're really helping Brooke's chances, Danyl.
There's this French novelist called Michel Houellebecq, and I'm thinking about him.
Welcome to a Wellington event, guys.
Because there were all these sort of talk about how we can really change things because of the coronavirus. And Houellebecq wrote the kind of like this open letter to the coronavirus, in which he sort of like criticised it for not being sexually transmitted, but he also said life after.
Sounds very academic.
Well, he also said that life after the coronavirus will be the same, only worse. And so what I'm and I kind of like often, especially in our politics in the last couple of weeks, have sort of felt that there is something to that. So what I kind of want from you, I guess, is sort of tell everyone here and me, like, what do we do that kind of like can be meaningful and can kind of bring about change? Like, what's the thing that people who aren't like number 3 on the Green Party list, like, what do the rest of us do to sort of make a difference?
I think that you recognise that the most radical thing that you can do is switch off from seeing yourself as an isolated individual and as part of a network of people, as part of a community. I hate to consistently keep referring to my maiden speech, but it's fresh in my mind because I regularly think about not being in Parliament. And one of the best pieces of advice that was ever given to me was actually by Marilyn Waring, which is, when you first go in there, write a list of the things that you're interested in and your kind of purpose, your kaupapa, and reflect on that whenever you feel uncertain, or every year or so at least. And if you're comfortable with the changes that have occurred, then that's cool, you've got your new thing, and you write that down. But if you're uncomfortable, then you leave. And I remember really vividly, there's a few different themes in it, but one of them is talking about the mental health crisis. And, I've been very open about the fact that I have depression and, I'm medicated for that. And anybody who has experienced any form of mental ill health knows that that is not a linear process. The very whack part of being a person who is in this position is regularly that people hold me out as somehow being successful or being able to get past it. And I'm like, you don't see me breaking down. You don't see the other sides of it. But in talking about that mental ill health crisis in that speech, I spoke about how that is the logical endpoint of kind of decades of this way of thinking systemically, which has effectively, through economic, social, criminal justice and otherwise policy, forced us to compete against each other, almost for competition's sake. Yep. A lot of people rationalise or argue that it is ultimately for the outcome of greater innovation or what have you. But what we actually end up with, if I end up talking to people about, what do you actually want from your life? What is it that you are aiming for? Why are you working so hard? Almost everybody will state things like, so I can do the thing that I love when I retire, so that I can spend more time with my kids, so I can, play my, guitar or whatever. Ukulele, we're in Wellington. And the whole kind of experience of that is demonstrative, I think, of actually trying to pull apart, why are we doing this? What is the point? Yep. Why are we stuck inside the system and we're playing this game and we're all competing against each other? And why do we accept that this is the kind of economic, social, etc., hierarchical structure that, we have? Some people just say the law is the law is the law. This is just the way that things are. I'm sorry, but things like, someone sleeping homeless outside the bottom of Louis Vuitton in Queen Street is not a natural phenomena. The rate of climate change that we have as a result of human interference with regard to carbon emissions is not a natural process, which leads you to the conclusion that we have, by our actions, done some pretty shit stuff. But those problems are man-made. I'm about to get to the positive point.
Okay.
Sorry. I was actually talking to a journalist today, and they were like, you don't give sound bites. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. He's like, here's the history. But I... the positive point of recognising how we actively or inactively, passively, by neglect, either by design or neglect, have ended up in this situation is recognition of the fact that we have the opportunity to act to change it. And that is when, you start to have the discussion about what you can actually do. Inside of the way that things presently operate, if you want to, sure, you can go into politics. But again, I don't think that parliamentary politics by itself has ever changed the world. I think that there are definitely people who have grasped opportunities at certain points in time to ram things through, but they have obviously then kind of faded into the distance. I think that the best, most sustainable way to bring about change is to do it from the ground up. Yep. And that is in recognising the people around you and building a neighbourhood. Who the hell knows their neighbours? I mean, maybe you guys do, but yeah, I don't. I have lived in rental properties my whole life and have moved around tons. You know, there's how many people here work in the gig economy and move from place to place and don't ever really get the opportunity to know their colleagues, and in turn that means that when you are experiencing problems, you don't necessarily share them with people. It's a problem with you. You know?
So we need to build a community, is that?
Yeah, we need to build a community.
That's my soundbite that I'm taking from what you've said.
We need to build a but that sounds really amorphous.
Yeah.
The way that you tangibly build a community is you talk to people, particularly people who you think you disagree with. It's real controversial. But in all seriousness, we have lost the capacity to have conversations because of how polarised we have enabled political discourse in particular to become. And I think that takes us full circle to your point. And this is not to say that everybody, particularly those who are being actively attacked by the people who are saying whatever, should be the ones to engage. But it is to say that when you're sitting around the Christmas table with racist Uncle Jim, you have a familial connection with racist Uncle Jim, and you are not the butt of his jokes, nor are you the one at the receiving end of the kind of culture that he is helping to perpetuate. So you have the opportunity to help change his mind, and he will listen to you.
He's persuadable.
Yeah. And I think ultimately all people are persuadable. I mean, I think that the silver lining is that all people are capable of all value sets, and that is simultaneously a very terrifying but also a very optimistic thing.
I don't agree with that at all.
Really?
Yeah, no.
Who's inherently evil?
Well, I don't think people are inherently evil. But I think, I really do believe that, I mean, there's a lot of literature in the political science about this idea of like the sort of big five personality types, the ocean model, which is like, I'm not going to remember them now, openness to new ideas, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion,
agreeableness
and neuroticism. Yeah. So
it was used by Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah. So and those guys know what they're doing. And so the idea is that like people with sort of like strong progressive left wing values tend to almost consistently be extremely open to new experiences, and people with like who are extremely conservative are at the other end of that spectrum, and they have a much stronger threat response to sort of the idea that things are going to change. But
you're looking at it from the wrong way around, I think. I think that if you manage to find ways to shift people's neuroticism or openness or agreeableness or what have you, then you manage to shift where they sit in the political space. Yeah. I think the only way to do that in an open and in an ethical way is to have those conversations with people as opposed to trying to manipulate them, which is what a lot of the kind of stuff that's happening on social media is. Yeah. See, I don't know. I don't know if you can shift them, but I know if you can sort of change the messaging. I mean, I use my dad as an example. Yeah. So do I. Yeah. I think, we've all got our dads. But like my old man would rile me up when I was growing up, and he would consistently talk about, because, he worked in finance, and, John Key's the man. And he would talk really disparagingly about Helen Clark. And I wouldn't necessarily go in to defend either of them. I didn't know anything about it, but I was just like, what is this weird thing? Because Dad would, go around to our friends' places, and, he would be drinking with the adults and having this conversation. And because I am an absolute nerd and precocious child, I would go and sit with them and end up having these conversations with the adults, or rather just listening to them. And he would be riling up our friends Ronnie and Tony, who were teachers, who were like, no, Helen Clark's amazing. And then I got older and learnt that Dad has actually only ever voted twice. Wow. Yeah. Okay. And I think that he was operating just as a contrarian because he loves to pull people's leg. But also, there is something exciting and enticing to people about winning an argument. Yeah. But then on top of that, there's the identity side of things, right? Yeah. And that's the really interesting thing when you have conversations with people, as I get to do all around the country, and people identify as being somewhere on the spectrum or with a certain political party, but their values don't necessarily align with that. There's just this kind of vacuous rhetoric that glues them to it, or their life experience. Yeah, I think like there's one way of thinking about sort of
where voters sit on ideological spectrums and political spectrums, is that there's like sort of a number of people who really, really strongly affiliate to a specific value system and a political party, and then there's the other 99% of the population who who don't, and they are like lots
who aren't necessarily swing voters, but don't necessarily feel super invested on an identity basis.
And some of them might just like a lot of it is about where you live and kind of what you do. Like if you live in a city and you work at a university, you'll probably be a left-wing voter, and if you live in a provincial town and you own a small business, then like it's sort of like there are these like what are they elective affinities, which kind of like mean that your political beliefs kind of line up with the way you vote just based on your kind of situation and how everybody else votes. And
there's a kind of team element to it as well, I think. Yeah.
So I have one last question. I thought I'd ask you about drugs, and then we'd take questions from the audience. And so, like, my question about drugs is more of like a long, rambling statement.
Wonderful.
Because normally when I host these things, that's what I get from the audience. So I kind of wanted to turn the tables a little bit. And so there's this like conservative argument that I'm actually like a little bit sympathetic to sometimes. That one of the problems with liberalism is that it kind of like it gives people freedom to do things that we kind of like want to do in the immediate short term, like, smoke drugs, for example, or play video games. And so that like kind of liberal societies sort of enable people to be free to do all of these things. But those things are kind of corrosive to sort of like longer term life satisfaction and happiness. And so my question to you is like, why do you want to sort of like destroy society and make happiness impossible?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the best kind of tweets that ended up coming off the back of the kind of few weeks in which we were simulating the conversation around the cannabis referendum and the euthanasia legislation passing is that people were talking about, it was actually a tweet from Family First about how you can smoke a joint and kill granny. And I would love to be in Bob McCroskey's head. But I think the first thing, kind of on the notion that, conservatives are trying to block people from doing things that can be corrosive to them. I really want to challenge that because, oftentimes conservatism looks back with really rose-tinted lenses at, for example, the 1960s or what have you. And I find that really fascinating because at that point in time, there were a lot of people who were really bloody unhappy. And the same way that there's a lot of really bloody unhappy people right now. But, if you think about the fight for particularly recognition of someone's existence, and the way that people were jailed for, sleeping with people of the same sex or what have you, there are a lot of people who are not necessarily doing something that is corrosive to their morals or whatever. It's actually about recognizing and coming to find who they are and therefore their purpose, identity, etc. So that's kind of one side of it. With regard to the drugs debate, this is where it's really interesting to me because ironically there is actually largely the same premise that emanates from both myself and the likes of conservatives, which is that we want to protect communities, we want to protect kids, and we want to stop people using harmful substances, particularly to excess. The problem is that cannabis prohibitionists are arguing whether cannabis should exist.
Yes.
We've lost that fight, and they have lost that fight. The argument then becomes with that premise, how do you best regulate to reduce that harm and to achieve that aim?
It is one of those things which in 10 years' time the leader of the National Party will be relaxed about, isn't it?
They're very relaxed, very relaxed.
It's maybe suspiciously
Some things never change. But the other thing around drugs, which is so fascinating, and actually about pretty much all of the things that have been outlawed or prohibited, particularly traditionally, which are like the hallmarks of kind of conservatism, are things which people in positions of power did regardless of the laws.
Yes.
If you want to talk about things like prostitution, if you want to talk about things like drugs, if you want to talk about things like, same-sex sex, a lot of those things were still undertaken by people in power with no recourse or enforcement.
The illegality was not evenly distributed.
Absolutely not. But actually it was to perpetuate a mythology which justified the oppression of certain people in society. And that's on record, actually, if you want to talk about drugs, by, I've forgotten his name, Eichmann, who was one of the key advisors to Richard Nixon. And he ended up coming out in approximately 2012, speaking to a journalist, I think, for Time. And he was reflecting on when Nixon first came into office and how they were, working through what kind of laws they would create around drug prohibition. And he effectively says, and I'm going to terribly misquote this, but something along the lines of, we knew that we could, there were two enemies of the Nixon campaign and a kind of the conservative agenda, and it was the anti-war left and the blacks searching for civil rights and recognition. And, we couldn't make being black or being anti-war illegal, but we could make drugs illegal, which enabled us the opportunity to then go and break up their meetings, arrest them and harass them night after night on the evening news. So it's all a mythology, folks.
So we're going to take questions now. Bring them on. Shout them out. Maybe I should ask for raised hands.
There's a roaming microphone.
Okay. Oh, is there?
Tēnā korua. Thanks for this talk. My question's about, you talked about the parliamentary system being a bit trash. So my question is basically, what would be your ideal system, and or what might be a nice tweak we could make to the current one?
You've enabled me to talk about one of my favourite topics that I was told in 2017 I should never talk about by one of our media advisors because it's boring. And constitutional reform, my friend. So I am a big fan of a Supreme Codified Constitution. And I think a lot of people have a gut reaction to it and think about immediately the United States and the model that they have and the challenges that they have in changing it. But I think also on the flip side, a lot of people don't recognise that right now the only thing that upholds your rights, supposedly, is the Bill of Rights Act 1990, Section 4 of which says that if there is any piece of legislation which is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights, then the inconsistent legislation overrides your rights, because we have a concept called parliamentary supremacy. So
that was like a really standard thing during the Key administration. Like,
if we want to talk about disability carers and I think that's a problem. I think that's also a problem because it places supremacy in the parliament, not in the hands of people. So you can go to the Supreme Court and ask for a declaration of inconsistency, but it actually doesn't enable the court to hold parliament to account, which I think places far too much power in the hand of politicians as opposed to in the hands of citizens. And arguably, the typical response is, but we have elections every 3 years. But the problem that I see is this kind of downward spiral whereby people become disengaged because they don't see action occurring in the things that they care about. And ironically, when politicians behave badly and people go, that's bullshit, I'm not engaging with that, you actually give it a hall pass to continue. Because if you are not, like all of the people who are currently in Parliament are there because you elected them or you neglected to elect them. You neglected to elect an alternative. You neglected to campaign for something and to build the case and the mandate within broader society for that change. So I think that constitutional reform would enable us to actually look at the format of Parliament. Right now, our Parliament literally, by design, is modelled on Westminster. And the funny thing about that is that the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister's seat is literally 2 swords length apart, because the adversarial model is about fighting, and someone comes up with a better kind of idea simply by virtue of winning, which I think is also problematic because then you end up the baby being thrown out with the bathwater because somebody's name is attached to something. We also have a really, really terrible culture of despising it when politicians do what we call flip-flopping. And I mean, oh my God, how great would it be if people changed their mind when confronted with new evidence? We just don't like that to happen with our leaders. So we really back people into a corner. So I think that's kind of cultural change, which again I think could be facilitated by taking far more, often people kind of hold up select committees as a great model or example, but I also think that select committees operate in a way that can come across as rather inaccessible to a lot of people, because there's a difference between transparency and accountability or accessibility, right? Like New Zealand consistently ranks race towards the top of the world in transparency stakes, but then accountability and accessibility is all to do with whether average Joe can actually read what the hell's going on and make heads or tails of it. And that's, I was about to go on a sidetrack of 5G and about conspiracy and kind of anti-authoritarian moves and kind of culture and stuff, but I'll hold that. And I think that we basically, fundamentally, in a nutshell, need to kind of have a parliament that is modelled on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and is far more actually respecting of where we're at as a country, where we can be, and, you know, the treaty. But that will also open the door to a far more constructive and collaborative space, because if you look at Te Ao Māori and tikanga kind of approaches to resolving conflict, it is, ultimately just far more constructive than the way that we currently do things.
Do we have any 5G questions out there? How it's causing the Rothschilds to...
I have a triangle tattoo which somebody identified in a photo and said that it was
classic Illuminati.
Yeah. No, it's just I got it when I was 20.
I do actually have a 5G question. How concerned are you about the growth of misinformation and this kind of international movement to distrust government and to distrust science? And how do you think that might impact on our election?
It's ironic, I think, because it's actually what localism looks like. And it's something that particularly as well, like on the left, we celebrate and we go, that's a really cool thing. But I think that it's difficult, like often when we have these discussions, people are like, where do we lay blame? It's the institutions themselves, it's the media. The thing is, it doesn't matter where we lay blame. It ultimately matters how we resolve that conflict, that tension, and end up in a place where people are able to access and trust information. But I think that kind of anti-authoritarian bent is largely born of feeling very let down by the status quo. And it's ironic that that's led some people to do things like vote for Donald Trump, who arguably is representative of a lot of the status quo with regard to, you know, how he made his money and otherwise. And I think the only way that we actually begin to unpick all of that has to be a grassroots effort. And that sounds very blasé, kind of classic left-wing politician response, but it's not going to be able to be resolved from the top down. You can have strongmen leaders, or you can have, leaders who symbolise kindness and compassion and otherwise, but you're still going to end up with all of this kind of misinformation when you have the democratisation of communication like we do on social media platforms, and people feel as though their voice doesn't matter in those traditional spaces. So perhaps it's a better form of participatory democracy. Perhaps it is finding those spaces for people to come together as communities, because this stuff is largely being facilitated online. And when you are online, you are able to find your tribe of people, for lack of a better term, who all agree with you ideologically and go further down that rabbit hole in a way that was technically and literally impossible decades ago, because you had to have these conversations with people in your neighbourhood. People will be like, okay, Joe. But you know what I mean? So I think it's, just finding those spaces to have conversations with people and meeting them where they're at. I don't think there's an easy quick fix or a silver bullet. But I am concerned about it when leaders hold themselves up as being the sole arbiter of truth, and kind of insist that people bypass the so-called mainstream media. And this distrust of media is a real concern.
We got another one? How much time have we got? I think maybe we've got...
About 5-10 more minutes.
Yeah, okay. Maybe sort of like one kind of reasonably short question and one kind of more sort of... I'm not going to say it long, rambling answer.
Yeah, I don't do
I
pithy,
mean,
I'm
sort
sorry.
of like expansive and thoughtful answer. Okay, anyone out there?
There's someone at the back.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for talking. And I guess there's just something that you've said like a couple of times now. Like I've heard you say it at the Aotearoa Town Hall, and that was like a weirdo like me can get into Parliament like anyone can. I don't know, like it's always just like just felt a little bit itchy to me because like I think it's incredible that as a young person you got into government, but like the reality is you have to like still be able to talk a certain way and like, you know, put yourself on stage and like act a certain way and be like okay with like being in the public eye a lot, and that's like not accessible to everyone. Not to mention like there's like whole swathes of people that like society kind of just rejects like in a social what's the word? Like
mainstream
realm.
Yep.
Like I don't know, like I can't see a gang member going to Parliament or like a homeless person, for example.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you for your question. So I am being flippant when I say that. And the reason that I'm flippant in saying that is also kind of because between the lines I'm pointing to the fact that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily, oh man, this is going to sound awful, but the ad heaps. There are a lot of people who are just kind of there. I mean, they do represent their constituencies and otherwise, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, sure, absolutely, I 110% agree with you that there are masses of levels of privilege that come into the equation when it comes to even beginning to apply to set foot in the place. Not to mention the stupidity or confidence requisite to even put yourself forward. And, you know, I can't remember who wrote it. Anyway, I'm going to park that because I can't remember who wrote it. But the kind of core thing to recognise is that, again, change is not going to come from the top down. I don't think, and I'm regularly having discussions with, you know, it's obvious where I sit on the political spectrum, and I've got mates who are anarchists and all sorts of things and don't want to engage in parliamentary politics and just keep calling for kind of a revolution and all of these kinds of things. And I guess my response always is that I don't know how to do that. I think that is why we need to support more leaders coming through, and that leadership doesn't need to occupy a chair in Parliament. It can look a lot of different ways. And that, for me, is the importance of also recognising that, you know, everybody has different characteristics, and I've seen it in terms of the way that, for example, you know, Marama can say something and, you know, get a number wrong on economics and will be treated entirely differently to how James is treated. And that is to do with when you are somebody who represents supposed diversity or has a characteristic that isn't indicative of you being part of the mainstream, is the thing that makes you different. You are held out as being representative of everybody who holds that characteristic, and that will be held over you when you make a mistake. And therefore, that is used as a rationale to continue to push out people who look like you. So I guess the only thing that I can say is that I think it's really important that we continue to support leadership in all of its forms, that we recognise that our parliament is not the best that it can be right now in terms of representation and in terms of kind of mixture of skill sets. And also that we need to engage in recognising the roles that people can play outside of parliamentary politics to facilitate political change.
One of the best books I've ever read about political change is this book, Master of the Senate, and it's about the civil rights movement in the US. It's set during the 1960s, and the kind of key characters are Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson. And so King is the head of a movement and Johnson is the master of the Senate. He's sort of like the ultimate deal-making politician And the book really makes the very persuasive argument that change doesn't happen without both of them. Yep. Like the movement creates the pressure, and then the politician, the deal maker, actually kind of like uses it. And
that's the distinction between culture and structure that I was kind of talking about before, right? Like there's the creation of the rules that all of us have to abide by, but then there is the cultural change that can be conducive to that structural change. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that's where we'll finish it, I think. Okay. Are we free to go?
I mean, I don't know. Are you guys free to go?
Maybe do we have one more question?
Yeah, okay, we can have one more question.
Yeah, okay. We've got a question at the back. Key thing.
Where's all the Rona talk? I came here sort of expecting world war, COVID, COVID changed everything, but it seems like, I don't know, that you're sort of talking about theories and strategies and concepts of the world that were kind of the same as what they were before times. Is that the case? Have those things not changed for you?
Well, I mean, I did try to ask about that, but I also kind of think that like corona.
It's all my fault, Keith. I'm sorry.
Coronavirus is like kind of a public health crisis and not a political crisis. So it means that the rules of politics don't seem to have changed.
No, I mean again, the structure hasn't changed, but what has changed is culture. And I think that people have seen that things are possible. So, one of the things that drives me up the wall is that people, all of these things that all of us were told were impossible for so long, housing the homeless, creating flexible working arrangements for sole parents or for people with disabilities, raising the core benefit, all of these things have been happening almost overnight and therefore being exposed as literally just a matter of political willpower. So that kind of potential for change is there if we want to grab it. And it has demonstrated how quickly things can change when presented with an entirely different context or new variables. And it's the same kind of thing that I was talking about with regard to the kind of the catalytic point of it took a synthetics crisis for us to have a meaningful discussion about the kind of changes that we would want in legislation, and then other important variables with regard to the opposition doing their bits and pieces in order. So things kind of have to line up. What COVID-19 does is changes the context and enabling people to rewrite the rules if they want to. But the thing that I have learnt about working with politicians across the aisle is that the mainstream approach to things inside of Parliament is deep risk aversion. Politicians will not change or will not act to change things unless they feel as though there is big public pressure behind that, or as though it'll win them votes or whatever. So if you want change, you have to put politicians' jobs at risk. That's how you change things.
Okay, I think we'll finish it there with Chloe's job at risk. That's a good way to end.
So is at risk. Yeah. I mean, have you seen the polls? Please vote green.
True. Yeah. And buy beer from Meow. Those are good kind of two action points from the evening. So thanks very much, Chloe. Thanks for coming in.
I hope I left you all with a positive message to take home.
Okay, right. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.